And the first is by Christian Locatell, and he'll be talking about a semantic map of adverbial conjunctions in classical Hebrew. So go ahead, Christian. You have 18 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. Good to be here. So, adverbial conjunctions often communicate a variety of semantic relationships between clauses. Several studies over the past couple decades have explored the conceptual organization of such variation, particularly Kortman, Martovich, and Heterle. And Kortman focused on European languages. Martovich and Heterle are based on worldwide samples, but they don't include ancient extinct languages. In this talk, I'll look at adverbial conjunctions, which had finite clauses in classical Hebrew, and ask whether we find the same polysemy patterns and grammaticalization paths as are found in typological surveys focusing on Indo-European and modern languages. So first, I'll look at some points of methodology. Next, at the development of multifunctional adverbial conjunctions in classical Hebrew, and present a semantic map of their uses. And as will be seen, not only can they be plotted contiguously on semantic maps, but corpus data also reveal plausible bridging contexts. And then lastly, I briefly consider the main sources of adverbial conjunctions in classical Hebrew vis-a-vis typological tendencies, and consider how the picture in classical Hebrew corresponds to the Zipfian inverse relation hypothesis. So methodology, no real surprises here. I took three main steps. First, I examined corpus data of classical Hebrew, roughly spanning the first millennium BCE. And next, I heuristically employed diachronic semantic maps to generate hypotheses about the relationship between uses. And then using these known grammaticalization paths as a guide, I looked for plausible bridging contexts that fall between senses adjacent on the semantic map, which may reveal the sort of contexts and inferential processes that facilitated the extension from use A to use B, even from synchronic data. And of course, when it comes to classical Hebrew, this helps mitigate the challenge of a complex textual transmission of the Hebrew Bible, for instance, as well as the fact that adverbial conjunctions often already have a wide semantic range in the earliest layers of the language. So the presence or absence of plausible bridging contexts provides support or falsification for the diachronic hypotheses generated by the semantic maps. So here is the data I've gathered for multifunctional adverbial conjunctions in classical Hebrew. I've identified 8 whose multifunctionality is, I think, fairly clear. Others could possibly be argued, but I felt these were clear. 5 out of the 8 contain a relative element or are a bare relativizer, and several are formed from the combination of a preposition and relativizer. And they're organized here within the major semantic domains of adverbial conjunctions, especially identified by Kortman: modal, temporal. CCC refers to a group of logical interclausal relations, especially cause, condition, and concession, and the locative semantic space. And the uses I found for each adverbial conjunction line up along contiguous portions of semantic maps of this word class. So from this usage profile, from the usage profile of these adverbial conjunctions, along with known grammaticalization paths and inferential processes for similar words, one may propose a diachronic semantic map that looks like this. As we can see here, there's a much more complex internal structure than seen in the more schematic map on the previous slide. You can see a small version of it there in the upper left. However, this semantic map of Hebrew adverbial conjunctions more or less mirrors the structure that you see. So time doesn't permit to go into all the details, but to give you a brief tour, the temporal domain has the strongest affinity for development into CCC relations, like cause, condition, concession, with certain temporal subsenses being especially attracted to particular CCC subsenses. We also see extensions from the modal domain with the subsense like comparison as if, or assimilative as, according, excuse me, accord as, it is said, for example, or equative constructions as P, so Q. These are most likely to extend into the temporal domain. And finally, we see extensions from the locative domain with the sense of where or wherever into the CCC domain, and specifically cause. So this fits the typological expectation that senses in the CCC domain are the prototypical gold network of semantic extension of adverbial conjunctions, and has the strongest sources in the temporal semantic space. However, as we'll see, this can be amended based on further corpus analysis. So looking at just some of the paths to illustrate this, while we don't have time to look at all the various extensions in detail, we can consider some between the main semantic domains by way of illustration. And here I'll be focusing on plausible bridging contexts, but for the sake of time, won't go over the details of each example. So first, we see extensions from the modal domain. In example one, we see a bridging context for the extension from the modal domain to the temporal domain, specifically from simulative to simultaneous overlap. Here we see an interesting case, since it seems to show a plausible bridging context for the extension from simulative to cause, or from as PQ to because PQ, with the adverbial conjunction ka'asher. While typologically known, this is much less common than extension from time to cause. So in this example, in 1 Samuel 28:18, we read, "Inasmuch as, or because, you did not obey the voice of Yahweh and did not execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek, therefore Yahweh did this thing to you today." So here the modal adverbial conjunction draws on a relation of correspondence between the verbal action in the main and adverbial clauses, which invites a causal implicature. In such cases, simulative ka'asher seems to be reanalyzed, or be able to be reanalyzed, as a causal conjunction when the degree or extent of the verbal idea in the adverbial clause is compared to that in the main clause. So based on such contexts found in corpus data, I added this to a revised map that we'll see below. Looking at extensions from the temporal domain, we find several types of plausible bridging contexts to the CCC, cause, condition, concession, etc. domain. Here we see from simultaneous overlap to cause, and there are also clear examples of simultaneous coextensiveness to condition, which unfortunately we will not dwell on now. Looking at example 5, we can see a possible extension from the locative to the CCC domain, or from where PQ to because PQ, with the adverbial conjunction ba'asher, which is made up of a clitic locative preposition, be, with the relativizer asher. So in this example from Genesis 39:23, we read, "The captain of the prison did not pay attention to anything in his charge." Speaking of, this is the Joseph story, and if you're familiar with the story of Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt. So, and it says, "The captain of the prison did not pay attention to anything in his charge, in that or because Yahweh was with him." So here the adverbial conjunction ba'asher, which is typically used to communicate a locative adverbial relationship like where, has a strong causal implicature. That is, the situation of Joseph having favor with the prison captain appears to maybe be metaphorically construed as being within the situation in which Yahweh was with Joseph and thereby causing Joseph to be favored. So in such contexts, this extension could be facilitated by a metaphor like containment equals causation, possibly, where being within a situation is construed as being caused by a situation. But this was a difficult case for me. So if anyone has other suggestions to explain this polysemy pattern, I would be interested to hear. However, the other locative conjunction, al-asher, which I crossed out at the top there, it has the same polysemy pattern, but I couldn't find any plausible bridging contexts. So I removed it from the revised semantic map that we'll look at later. So moving to the CCC domain, this is the prototypical goal network in the development of intercausal relations. And we see several expected extensions within the CCC domain, from cause to concession here, but also from conditional to concessive condition to concession, which we will also skip for the sake of time. So here again is the semantic map of multifunctional adverbial conjunctions in classical Hebrew with some modifications. The highlighted paths are those illustrated in the above examples. As typologically expected, the major characteristics we can observe are that the CCC network of semantic relations is the prototypical goal in the development of adverbial conjunctions, also in classical Hebrew. Temporal relations are the prototypical input of CCC relations. Somewhat less expected from a typological perspective is the development of CCC uses from the modal and locative semantic spaces. So there's the addition of a proposed path from simulative to cause based on plausible bridging context in the corpus. But based on a lack of bridging context, you can see that squiggly red line where I remove that proposed path and the X out of the al-asher from the bottom of the inventory. And there are no observations, there are no observed extensions between the locative and modal interclausal relations. Now, as for the question of distinguishing pragmatic polysemy from semantic polysemy, for these polysemous adverbial conjunctions, maybe you can tell which view I take, there's good reason for seeing them as genuine polysemy based on some criteria, semantic uniqueness, and divergent syntactic profiles. But again, we press on. So far, the paths of development considered have been on internal developments within the word class of adverbial conjunctions. Here is data on the sources of adverbial conjunctions from other word classes based on transparent material incorporated into the forms. And what sticks out is the overwhelming preference in classical Hebrew to develop adverbial conjunctions from prepositions and relativizers, often in conjunction with each other. Considering the data proposed, reported by Kortmann for European languages, and the data reported by Martovich from a worldwide sample, adpositions indeed are a very important source for adverbial conjunctions, with relativizers less so. However, this data from classical Hebrew reveals a significant preference to develop adverbial conjunctions from prepositions and relativizers. And indeed, I don't have statistical data on this beyond classical Hebrew, but this is a common observation made by Semitists, and so that's an interesting question of whether this constitutes a feature of the Semitic language family. Finally, how does this data correspond to the Zipfian inverse relation hypothesis? As stated by Kortmann, that the higher the degree of polyfunctionality, the lower will be the degree of morphological complexity, and vice versa. I've categorized each of the 42 adverbial conjunctions I found in classical Hebrew according to 3 basic parameters: morphological complexity, semantic polysemy, that is how many interclausal relations it can communicate, and syntactic polyfunctionality, that is what word classes a form belongs to outside of that of adverbial conjunction. And in this table, we see the correlation between morphological complexity and semantic polysemy. While the relatively small amount of data results in some holes, there nevertheless seems to be a discernible trend for morphologically more complex forms to have fewer interclausal relations, and for morphologically simpler forms to have more. Most notably, it's only mono-word adverbial conjunctions which have 4 or more interclausal relations, with phrasal and phrasal adverbial conjunctions having no more than 2, and discontinuous adverbial conjunctions never having more than 1. And the same holds true when we look at the syntactic multifunctionality of each adverbial conjunction. This table shows the correlation between semantic polysemy, again, how many interclausal relations a form can communicate, and syntactic multifunctionality, whether that form has functions in other word classes. So in this table, we can clearly see that the more semantically polysemous an adverbial conjunction is, the more likely it is to be syntactically polyfunctional, and vice versa. This data also shows that the inventory of adverbial conjunctions in classical Hebrew overwhelmingly contains forms which have 1 meaning and 1 function, outnumbering polysemous and polyfunctional forms 85% to 15. And this is consistent with the tendency reported by Kortmann in the data of modern European languages. Does this indicate a greater value placed on precision rather than economy? I'm not sure. However,
Sorry, Christian, you need to close it up soon.
Okay. However, this contrasts with the data reported by Kortmann on extinct European languages in his sample, like Ancient Greek and Old English, in which polysemous and polyfunctional adverbial conjunctions significantly outnumber monofunctional and monosemous ones. Okay, so in summary, the usage profile of polysemous adverbial conjunctions in classical Hebrew fills a contiguous portion of known grammaticalization paths. The heuristic application of established diachronic semantic maps is fruitful for generating hypotheses for the development of comparable phenomena, even in ancient non-Indo-European languages, and for locating plausible bridging contexts for semantic extensions. Uses which display traits such as semantic uniqueness and divergent syntactic profiles provide evidence for genuine semantic polysemy. And such an approach offers a way around the relatively limited time depth and data of the classical Hebrew corpus. Notably, classical Hebrew shows an unusually large preference for deriving adverbial conjunctions from prepositions and relativizers, which may constitute a feature of Semitic more generally. As expected, the data from classical Hebrew is consistent with the Zipfian inverse relation hypothesis. However, less expectedly, classical Hebrew shows a tendency for monosemy and monofunctionality of adverbial conjunctions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christian. Now we have several minutes for questions. I see Dorit raising her hand. Go ahead, Dorit.
Yeah, thank you very much for this talk. It was really enlightening for me because you showed the interaction of several classes of function words and the origins of current adverbial expressions, conjunctions, maybe prepositions in modern Hebrew. So what I'd like to ask is for information. Have you published this yet?
Some of the data has been given in published material, but not all of it, no. And not the comparative data on the sources of the adverbial conjunction.
Yeah, that's what I'm interested in. For example, you wrote something about adpositions, so I'd like to know what they are. So I don't want to impose, you know, on the time of the other people here, but can you send me your presentation?
Sure, yeah, of course.
Okay, so I'll write you. Thank you very much. That was so interesting.
Thank you.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi got lost. I'm here again. Okay, so are there any more questions? Yes, Mira. We can't hear you.
Sorry, you have key there, but you don't have o, which is a connective I've been very much interested in. Is there any reason? I mean,
I was trying to limit the sample to connectors with some sort of semantic adverbial meaning. So that's just a convenience reason, I guess, for leaving it out. But yeah, of course, it would. You're right. It would be enriched to include more types of connectors.
because that's plenty polysemous.
Right, right.